War, what is it good for? Our experiences of recent years have left us very wary of foreign interventions, but do we sometimes have a moral responsibility to intervene, or is the moral course for us to stand by and out of conflict, or is morality irrelevant in all of these decisions?
I think there is a risk that we draw the conclusion from the disastrous consequences of some recent interventions that we therefore decide that no such intervention can ever work. And I think that would be an erroneous conclusion to draw. I think there are circumstances in which it makes sense, because it is unfortunately the only resort, to intervene with some form of military equipment. And yet we are in a position now where that argument is very difficult to prosecute because we are in the shadow of such horrendous examples. So to draw an overarching conclusion from those examples would, I think, be in error. And when I say that, I don't think we're just flying blind. We've got a huge scholarly tradition behind us which can guide us in trying to assess the circumstances for intervention or not. The just war tradition is deep and scholarly. It has two parts. Firstly, there must be a just cause, and secondly, war must be conducted according to just criteria. There's also a movement to add a third part, which is justice in the post-war reconstruction, but that's not the ancient discipline. It starts with Cicero, book 1 of the De Officiis. It goes through St. Augustine and comes to a real fruition with Thomas Aquinas. And there is a very strong argument that there has to be just purpose, and we can argue about what that entails. And secondly, that then the conduct of the war must itself follow arguments of procedural justice. And the case against interventions like Iraq is that it did not follow those precepts. That there is perfectly good reason why that intervention did not work. If you look at Tony Blair's Chicago speech, which is essentially an attempt to update Aquinas, it wasn't advertised as such, but that's in effect what it does. The fifth criteria of intervention in that speech is that the intervention should have a reasonable hope of practical effect. Absolutely perfectly reasonable to say there was no prospect of that in the case of that intervention, therefore it should have fallen foul of his own precepts. And there's a brilliant remark somebody once made of neoconservatism, is that the problem with it is it's not conservative enough. And the just war thesis is a very conservative thesis, but it does leave open the prospect that if there is no other option, in the case, for example, of a genocide or a war to the last for civilization, that military involvement has to be kept in reserve for fear that there is nothing else. If we get to the position where we don't allow that in any circumstances at all, then we are potentially at times in peril.
I don't think we can really say we're reluctant to intervene when this country is involved in a whole number of interventions and has been over recent years. If you look in the last 15 years, which is where we've had the War on Terror, or it changes its name, but it was started off as the War on Terror. Maybe it changed its name because it was clearly not doing what it sought to achieve. But if you look at those interventions, I would argue in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, where we're now talking about going back into war again, that all of these have actually made the situation worse, that the people of Afghanistan are fleeing as refugees from a war which is still continuing after all those years, as are the people of Iraq and Syria. So it seems to me, I'm not a pacifist, I'm not somebody who says totally that war is wrong. I was brought up by parents who were involved in the Second World War and who suffered in the Second World War in all sorts of ways. So I know that people sometimes have very strong motivations for going to war, but there has to be, in modern time, there has to be a reason for doing it, which isn't just about the strategic interests of the West and isn't just about supporting some governments and not others. If you look at the consequences of war, they are absolutely appalling, and therefore there has to be a very, very high bar that needs to be crossed before you can possibly do it. If you look at the refugees today, if you look at the people in Fallujah today, and whatever side you are on over this, these people in Fallujah have suffered now since 2004 with war, occupation, siege, and are still suffering as a consequence. I believe that the growth of ISIS actually developed as part of the occupation of Iraq. If you look at where the ISIS leaders came from, they met in a prison in southern Iraq under the occupation. And I hesitate to bring up the Chilcot report, which is going to report in a month after all these years. But if you look at what Eliza Manning Buller, the head of MI5, said, for example, she told the government that it would make the threat of terror much, much greater. And this is the situation we're in. I also think when we're talking about morality of war, we should also talk about the morality of people who oppose wars. And today of all days, when we're, I hope all of us, mourning the death of Muhammad Ali, we should remember that he was one of a generation who fought and sacrificed to oppose the war in Vietnam. Now, I was a teenager in those years, and I remember how much everybody told us that war was justified, how much it was about fighting communism, how much the people of Vietnam would appreciate the liberation. We know now, I don't know how the other panelists feel about Vietnam, but probably few people now would defend that war as a just war or as a war that we should be involved in. So let's look at the people who stand up against war and who say these things are wrong, who have a moral opposition to it and who sacrifice very, very often. In my view, the world would be a much better place if they were listened to rather than to the governments and the military who take us into so many wars.
We've created for ourselves a false dichotomy. I mean, we've heard about two wars, both of which absolutely were contested at the moment of their initiation and through their conduct, Iraq and Vietnam. And what I think, in my view, we've done, we've created on the one hand, the idea that war should unequivocally be necessary, and the polar opposite of that is always presented as a war of choice. And this seems to me a totally unhelpful way of looking at these problems. The war of necessity takes us back to the idea of the Second World War, a war where it would seem we had no choice, where there was an existential conflict, and it's from that we have a UN Security Council, we have a UN Charter which says, the only war that is genuinely legitimate is a war of national self-defense. And the paradox in that is that the only war that a state is individually entitled to engage in terms of international law, is essentially a very, very big one. There's no option there for a more limited war, which is the sort of conflicts we're talking about. There is no capacity for what we've come to call a war of choice, but that is exactly, it seems to me, where we trip ourselves up, because, as has absolutely rightly been said, the barrier for going to war needs to be very high. It needs to be seen to be unequivocally necessary for it to be warranted to take up arms, whether that's a moral necessity or a national interest necessity. Either way, there needs to be an unequivocal necessity. And once we therefore have made that decision, then we need to recognize that the commitment is equivalent to being to necessity. Clausewitz, a man I perhaps hesitate to mention, you hesitate to mention Muhammad Ali, I should hesitate to mention Clausewitz when we're talking about war, but Clausewitz argued that war actually begins with defense and not with attack. If you invade another country, then actually the other side can simply accept that invasion. There is no necessary resistance, there's no necessary response. So the paradox is that the apparent aggressor is not the cause of war, it is actually the defender that is the cause of war. And this isn't just splitting words, because the choice, in other words, lies as much in the necessity, the decision to fight, as it lies in the decision to initiate the war in the first place. So my case essentially is that we should rid ourselves of this distinction and simply recognize that war is a very serious business. The challenge we now have, following out of the Chicago speech of 1999, is that the UN has adopted, alongside that principle of national self-defense, a wider principle, which is the responsibility to protect. It cannot be implemented without a UN Security Council resolution, which is why it hasn't been implemented in the case of the Syrians and the fate that they are all undergoing. But it does seem to me extraordinary in the current context that we've become so bound up in the consequences of our own wars, and particularly of Iraq and Afghanistan, that we find ourselves inhibited in the ways in which we behave when there are genuinely humanitarian arguments and profoundly pressing moral arguments for engagement.